Up with an overview of the Santa Rita experimental range. Then our February presentation was with Fornata, and today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Doug Tolleson of Sonora Station with us. And Doug, I would say, comes with a high level of renown. So now working in Texas and been there for 15 years or so.
Yeah.
10 years, previously with the University of Arizona before that. And so very happy to have Doug not just here for the presentation, but to actually have Doug with us here in person. So thank you very much for making the trip over here for this. So in continuation with the theme, we're going to talk a little bit more. Doug will be talking a little bit more about Sonora Station, and again, over a century worth of research. And just in looking through the slides already, there's a lot of overlap between Santa Rita, what we saw last month with the Jornada research station as well. And that's kind of the point. And so in many ways, Doug's been the architect of, hey, we're doing the same things. Why don't we work together? Why don't we draw these, draw a line between the three different states, what we're trying to do. And so this is really a kickoff for all of that. And then bearing in mind for our wrap up in April, really relating back the century network between the three institutions, tying that to the kickoff of the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists for a panel discussion. So trying to talk about everything that we learned and then how does that apply again, both for where we are today and then ultimately where we're trying to head. So with that, I want to say thank you again to Dr. Tolleson, and we'll turn it over to yourself.
All right, thank you very much. So thank y'all for showing up. I know part of it is because of the barbecue. Part of it is because of the birds. And part of it's just, it's a beautiful day, and why not be out here in a little piece of heaven in an oasis like this. And so, I drove 2 days to get here. But couldn't be happier to be here. So the Sonora Research Station, if you're not familiar with it,
I'm doing the right thing for Alex.
I was going to share the screen so that everyone on the webinar can also see. Just let me show you PowerPoint slideshow.
And then say.
jump a couple there.
Is not working.
Get the screen down here on this one, but then instead of there. Okay.
It's like her meeting.
Yeah, okay, we're passing this, go back. That's where I could be.
There we go. Perfect.
So the buttons are working now.
Buttons are working. All right. Thank you, buddy.
So,
Go ahead. I'll move this while you talk.
so this is where the Sonora Research Station is. There at the yellow star. It's in the southwest corner of the state. It's in what I refer to as drive-through country because here's San Antonio, Austin, here's Houston, here's the DFW, Metroplex, the Big Bend. So a lot of people come through here. This is beautiful, wet, oasis type, Edwards Plateau, rivers. It gets pretty dry about right there. So a lot of people either turn around and go back to Austin, San Antonio, or they drive on through out to get to the pretty mountains. So that's where we are. We're at kind of a convergence of the Edwards Plateau, the Chihuahuan Desert, and the South Texas thorn scrub. We have a little bit of all that. That's where we're at. We're just kind of on the edge of the escarpment. Who was it that was talking about? Who was going to mess something up first today? I think I beat you to it. Okay, go ahead and move on. You're not going to sit there for the whole thing, are you? Okay, all right. So we've come a long way in 110 years at the station. And again, this is probably going to sound very, very familiar from what you've heard the previous months. The very first scientists who worked at the station stayed in canvas tents for a period of time until some houses were built. My wife and I, when we moved from Arizona to the Sonora Station, we lived in the first house built on that station for 5 years. So 100-year-old house, wood floor, scorpions, wasps, wind would blow through the windows, no insulation. Beautiful place. 2024, we got the ability through Starlink for me to be able to stand in a pasture, teach class in College Station. Live, sure. I don't think these folks would have ever envisioned that when they started, but they did have a vision. Okay. What was life like in 1916? So I'm not a big AI person. Artificial insemination, yes. I had been accused of having artificial intelligence, but I wanted to play with it a little bit, so I just kind of pulled some things out. What was life like in 1916 in rural Texas? Most of the transportation was still horseback, horse-drawn wagons, things like that. There were some vehicles started to appear. You saw the Model T in there. We'll get to that. Railroads for long trips, but to get around and do things, it's pretty much still horseback at that time. Communication, mail, not Pony Express. That didn't last very long. Did have party line telephones. Anybody here experienced party line? Yes. Yes. Anybody experience? Miss Smith, would you hang up? Talking to my girlfriend. Right, that happened. Music, and I'm gonna jump back to this and talk about something with regard to our station. When I pulled out something with regard to entertainment here, but fiddle tunes, the conjunto music and everything being down there on the border. Communities held dances, how people got together. I was not from that part of the world, but my grandparents talked about having people come over on Saturday and push the couch and the table back out of the way, and somebody would come over with a fiddle and they'd dance. And so that was going on, and that was a big part of this part of the world. Here's one I want to kind of pull on too. Average level of education, 1916 in rural Texas was pretty low. Grade school too. I think that's going to be important as we go forward. Okay. Now, there's some things here. I'm not making any political statements. Okay. One side of the aisle or the other. I'm just kind of pulling some facts out and then we'll talk about it. Oddly enough, there were problems along the U.S. Mexico border that had escalated during this time period. Because of the fighting that was going on in Mexico, thousands of Mexican refugees came across the river, found places in towns on the other side, and you can imagine those towns weren't prepared for them. Okay. Active then. It had come across the border and attacked some places in the American side. Woodrow Wilson sent 100,000 U.S. troops to the border 110 years ago. There was a new law in 2016 in Texas requiring young kids to go to school. That had not been required for that. New house cost about $1,300. You could order them from Sears, pre-Amazon, for as little as $600. Build a house. Okay. New car, $360 for that Model T. So things have changed. Some things are still the same. Some things it's just a matter of scale. Okay. So 10 years ago, just before I left Arizona, went back to Texas. I am a native Texan, by the way. Yeah, I'm sure you couldn't tell. I joked about the very first evaluation that I had here as a University of Arizona faculty. I tell everybody that they suggested I take English. It's not. So they had 100 years of the station in 2016. Had a big celebration. This is some excerpts from the publication that they put out. My guy who I succeeded there at the Sonora Station, kind of legend in the range business, Dr. Woods Taylor. He was there for 40 years. So it's kind of like following, I don't know, Luke Olson as a basketball coach, Nick Saban as a football coach, you know. A little bit of pressure to perform there. But he's a gentleman and a scholar, and he's kind of like having your favorite uncle. Right? He's been great. But he talked about how things were back around the turn of the century, and a lot of sheep were being herded around free range, bands of about 1,500. And as we began to drill wells there, they would drill a well. Several people might buy or purchase rights to that water, and they may graze in that general area. Well, there's only so far that sheep can walk in a day and that sort of thing. And so the areas around those wells started to be overgrazed. And the ranchers in that area they said they were very observant. They knew that they were having some problems with potentially poisonous plants. The quality of their products were starting to drop off. They were losing animals. They were experiencing drought. And so they realized that science was being done. The land grant university system had been started, 30 or 40 years previous to that. And it was time for them to have an experiment station in their part of the world. So, part of that was because of, again, the drought. And this is a University of Arizona product here. They used to call this a bark chart. I don't know if that's still the name of it. But anyway, brown areas are drought and blue areas are wet. And as you go up in that scale, you're going in extended time periods. And so it goes up to like 48 months. So the darker the brown, the drier the area, and the wider that becomes, and the taller that it becomes, those areas of the length of drought. In our part of the world down there, the Dust Bowl and all was dry, but it was not as serious as the drought of the 1950s. The drought of the 50s was the drought of record in Southwest Texas. And so back around the turn of the century, and after, they were also experiencing some severe drought. And we'll see some slides a little later. The magnitude of that drought was maybe less important as to how many animals we had out there. Okay. And this drought was especially problematic during the growing season. So again, another University of Arizona tool here. This flat line in the middle is the average rainfall for a given area that you put a point on a map. The green bars are standard deviations above, the round bars are standard deviations below. So for wet years, dry years. If you go back to that early 1900 time period, again, they were very dry during the key point of time when they needed to be growing forward. So this was really exacerbating the situation. So a very forward-looking group of ranchers met in Del Rio, Texas in 1915, realized they had some issues, began to band together, formed an organization called Texas Sheep and Goat Raisers, which is still in existence today, and put a committee together of these four gentlemen, Mr. Halbert, Mr. Brown, Mr. Taylor, and Mr. Murrah, to start a experimental ranch in Southwest Texas. Long story short, they were able to do that. They petitioned the Texas legislature to provide half of the money. Local people, ranchers, business owners, contributed the money for the other half of the ranch, about 3,400 acres. We still have a list of all the people that donated. And many of these people's families still ranch in the area and are our neighbors. So these are our founders. Makes this place a little bit different than some of the others because it was very rancher bottom up driven and became probably maybe one of the first examples, at least in Texas, of a public-private partnership. Didn't call it that, getting stuff done, but that's what we did. So now, one of the things that I think they wanted me to talk about in this series was we're close to a border here. Coronado is not very far from a border. That's something that we have in common. What kind of exchange has gone back and forth? As an experiment station, doing research, there hasn't been a lot of research back and forth across the border. There's been educational events that have, brought Mexican ranchers over, U.S. ranchers have gone over. But the biggest cultural connection there that I think has impacted everything we do at the station is that there's a little town down here called Zaragoza, about 12,000 people, I'm sorry. And it's about a 3-hour drive south of Sonora. So this is where I live. Here's where the station is. Highway 277, Del Rio, there's the river. There are a lot of people in our town of Sonora, in our area, who their families are from down here. So there's a lot of exchange that goes back and forth. A lot of the gentlemen who worked at the station over the last 100 years have come from that Zaragoza area. I don't know why. I don't know if there was an original family connection. I don't know why that connection was established, but there are a lot of our residents in Sonora who have family here. And there are a lot of people who go up and down that road on Friday evenings, Saturday evenings. So it's better to stay off the highway. All that to say is that we have had, even though not as much official university scientific type connection across the border, wherever people are, there are going to be connections back and forth. There's going to be family. There's going to be disputes. There are things that go on back and forth across this border, just like the one down here that shouldn't go on. But there are things that should, and family connection and trade back and forth across in a variety of goods. But trade does happen, and it still happens, even though the border is quote unquote closed. But it's a lot more closed than it was recently. We had a lot of bailouts and people, coyotes taking people across and being chased and running off into a ranch, and everybody keep jumping out and running, out across rangeland. We had people die. We had people that crawled up on the porch of ranchers and they tried to resuscitate them and couldn't, and everything. So it was an interesting time period there, and we're hoping it will go back to things like that. So, but anyway, there is that connection between these two towns. I don't know why, but it's there. So, I'm going to break the 110 years, and I'm going to try to cover a lot of stuff. I'm going to flash over a lot of things. We're going to sit around and have some barbecue later. You can come back and ask me questions about anything you want. Price of tea in China, anything that has to do with this, whatever you want. But the early work focused around a lot of veterinary science, animal science, toxic plants, developing some vaccines, looking at some different breeding programs and things like that. That kind of transitioned into over to looking at animal nutrition, grazing systems, some watershed work that was done on the range. And then we had more range science type people who were employed as scientists there. So we then transitioned into a prescribed fire and a term called pirate herbivory, which is just a fancy name for grazing and fire together, same landscape. And over the last 10 years, during my tenure there, we've centered around this concept of grazing animal physiology, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Assuming my voice will that. So this is one of the pioneer scientists that we had there back in the 20s and 30s. Dr. Hardy was a veterinarian at DVM. And he was one of the prime folks that developed a vaccine for a disease called sore mouth. And sore mouth is viral pox disease. I didn't show you pictures because I knew we were going to do this right before lunch. Some of the pictures can be pretty nasty. People can get this. So when we're handling the products, when we're handling the animals, we have to, we need to wear gloves. You don't want to, scratch your nose or move your eyes or anything because people can get it. It is zoonotic. But very debilitating disease was one of the problems that those ranchers were having, 20 years or so before this took place. So several ranchers have said from that era, if the experiment station had only done one thing, developing the sore mouth vaccine would have been worth all of the cost and all the expense because it saved thousands of animals. And it is not a pretty disease to see when they get that. So vaccine for a viral infection, 100 million doses or more were produced there in our little lab, about the size of this room, by people who were 25 miles out from the largest town. One was about 2,000 people, one was about 1,000 people. So not in a major urban area. Science, animal health was happening way out in the middle of nowhere. Dr. Leo Merrill, another one of our pioneers there. If you're familiar with grazing and range management, the Merrill 4-pasture 3-herd system was developed at this station by Dr. Merrill. And he's most well known for that. One of the things that he was also involved in, which turned out to be one of the big issues, time this picture was taken would have been about 40 or 50 years earlier. This plant called Sacagawea, you'll call it probably bear grass. It's an Olina. There's some different species of it here. Olina texanus is the one that we have. So that plant was apparently what was causing a lot of the issues back around the turn of the century. Drought, overgrazing. This is some of the only material that was still left there to be able to browse and graze. And when it puts the flowers on, they're very tasty, also very toxic. Causes another issue that I'm not going to show you pictures of. It's called big head. You can imagine it's a photosensitization. It causes, as the animals begin to put their head down, fluid develops in their head, blood vessels break, things like that. So another kind of a nasty disease. They discovered it was being caused by this plant. So where does the range management come in? How do we graze around this? How do we graze in such a way that there are other things to eat besides this? So a lot of range management started to come into play, coming off of that animal science and work with some of the other things that we do. So here's an early view of the station from probably about the 30s. So these buildings still exist. This building still exists. We have a big pavilion here now, the middle building. Look at how they're parked. Nobody's going anywhere. They're there for the day. Okay. And also a lot of times they're there for the night. And they may have been there for 2 or 3 days. Think about that entertainment. What was going on in the 1920s and 30s way out in the middle of nowhere, rural West Texas? No, there was some of that. But this was part of their social life, their culture. A lot of people, visited their family, had spouses, had babysitters. They put all the kids out. There was a swimming pool, not a swimming pool, tank, but it was a swimming pool. And when people are swimming in it, it becomes a swimming pool. This was a cultural hub for this part of the world. So I want to point out one more thing. This building here, it still exists. It's called the Fly House. Have you heard anything on the news recently about the New World Screwworm? Okay. We did not, or the station did not develop sterile fly technique here, but it was involved in that research. An entomologist named Orville Babcock was a USDA scientist that was assigned to work there. He used that area, it was streamed in, and it was really lovely odor, I'm sure, at that point in time. He developed a lot of the baits and a lot of the culture media that they were able to grow those flies on so that they could mass produce the sterile flies. So the Sonora Research Station has kind of come back around full circle now and may end up being involved in this New World Screwworm fly thing again. I don't think we're going to grow the flies and all, but we could certainly be a distribution point for it. And we do have the history of having worked for it, and we have a fly house. Okay. So again, when people came to the station, it was a big deal. But notice the gentlemen had their ties on. Okay. Lady here in her big hat, probably to keep the sun off too, but she's dressed up to go to town, go to a meeting. It was a big deal. Now they're standing out there in the trees and they're walking around in the dirt. They're out on a range. It was a big deal. Coming to the station to learn, socialize, enjoy a meal together, all of that fit together. We don't do that as much now, so I'm really happy y'all are doing that here. Okay. So we'll just go through some pictures. Again, I'm sure you've seen lots of the black and white pictures over the last couple of deals, and I can see some on the wall here. So these are just examples of, this is a ram test. So there's some Rambouillet wool sheep. These are some gentlemen that are, they have either consigned these rams and hoping they're going to sell for a lot, or they're trying to talk each other down on the price. These are the test pens there where they had different groups of rams that were fed, common diet, measured their performance and that sort of thing. People used to come from all over the world for this test. South Africa, all over the US. We had an airstrip. People would fly in to our little research station there and come to this central test. We also had range work that was going on, out looking at plants and things like that. So one of the things then that came out of the research that we've done here, and it started to kind of infiltrate everything else that we do as it should, is that this is how the stocking rates have changed on the station itself, which is very reflective of the area around us. We had almost 200 animals per square mile per section 110 years ago. Now, it was a lot less brush. There was a lot more good, what we call decreaser type grass, not as much of the increaser type grass. But as we started to graze more than we should and suppress fires, we started seeing an increase in the woody canopy. And now we can run about 20 animals. That's where we're at. And for where we're at, that's probably about right. But I'm going to talk about how we're going to continue to adjust that a little bit, some of the work that we're doing. So during this next year of looking at different grazing treatments and kind of transitioning not away from the animal and the veterinary science, but kind of adding more to the repertoire of what the station is doing. Dr. Merrill developed this pasture 3-herd system that he is known all over the world for now, and basically pretty self-explanatory. You have 4 pastures, you have 3 groups of animals. So there's always a deferred or a rested pasture. You move them on a 4-month interval, so that over the course of 4 years, no pasture is rested at exactly the same time each year. It's staggered. So during that time period, there will be a time when during the growing season, that pasture will be rested. Okay, and so the key thing here is not the same size of the pasture or the same size of the herd. It's the matching the carrying capacity of that pasture. They all need to be to make this work. So we're still working in those original 4 pastures. This is the schematic of, and I'll show you some pictures of that. So this is kind of a little bit of the evolution of how the grazing system research changed at the station over the years. This would have been back the 40s through the 60s. And I know you can't see the key or anything here, but you can kind of see the pasture fences and how they're laid out. So our station is in kind of a sort of a backward Z type shape. Changed into, kind of doing some different things, resting and doing some brush work and all in some of these pastures during the 70s and 80s. Then you'll notice in the 80s and 90s, these pie-shaped pastures, and a lot of these smaller type pastures. And as we started to see a lot of the sacred system type things and short duration, high density grazing and the amp grazing things that we hear about today. Some of that early work, not early, but I say some of the critical work during the earlier stages of clarity of some of that was done also here at the Sonora Station. A lot of animal nutrition, diet selection work here. There's some classic charts that you've probably seen in a lot of textbooks. Sonora Station was one of the places that came from. The Curve Wildlife Management Area over towards Kerrville along the Guadalupe River was also a place where a lot of this work was done, where animals were observed to see what types of plants they were eating. Pretty obvious is what we would think with cattle, sheep, and goats. Did the same thing with deer, but some of that early and kind of baseline work was done here at the Sonora Station. And this led into a line of work that has been going on for about the past 20 or so years now. And it was developed, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Walker, Dr. Straka, Al Campbell, worked on selecting goats to consume either more or less of juniper than the average of the herd. Juniper is one of those plants that has caused that woodland expansion that we saw in the previous chart. And not a lot of animals will eat a lot of juniper. Browsers obviously do. About 20% we think on the average for goats, and it probably fluctuates more with deer, sometimes more or less. But these animals were observed that some of them ate more juniper than others. So they started to be selected for animals that ate more, bred to animals that ate more. Animals that ate less were bred to animals that ate less, to have a scientific comparison and control. And so this has been hugely successful to meet the objective of creating a line of goats that will eat a lot more juniper than your average type goat, and also those that will eat a lot less. Okay, what does that mean out in the real world? Can we use those for targeted grazing to put them in places where we have more juniper? Can we breed that gene into our goats and just overall raise the amount of juniper that they consume so that they can survive better on the types of pastures that we have? And can we use them as tools? So this has been a very, very successful line of research that they've done. Prescribed fire, again, Dr. Butch Taylor kind of started off in that grazing, animal nutrition, behavior type field where he was very successful and very well known, and he sort of morphed into a prescribed fire guru, especially in Southwest Texas. Started the prescribed burn associations where people get together, share resources, share liability, tools, being able to get together as neighbors helping neighbors do these types of activities because we knew we needed to reintroduce fire into those ecosystems. So Dr. Taylor, again, mentor of mine, learned a lot from him. We're burning here in these pastures on some studies that he started, some long-term pastures. I still get to go and walk in his shoes and Dr. Merrill's shoes. It's been one of the privileges of working at this station. So we are continuing that prescribed fire research. This is a paper that we published out of, again, some of the plots that Dr. Taylor started 30 years or so ago, looking at the typical fire return interval for our part of the world, about 5 to 7 years, looking at it during a summer growing season or a winter dormant season in Nora control. We have some replication there. Kind of during the latter part of Dr. Taylor's career, he was out traveling so much, promoting this prescribed burn association concept, and with some droughts and all, they skipped one of those 5 to 6 year burn intervals. When I arrived, it was time to do them again. So we went back, East Orange was the postdoc that I had, we burned those plots again. The vegetation from those over the 30 years had begun to be very divergent on the type of species that you have there. Summer burn, much less woody plants, more of a savanna type in those winter burns and more of closed woodland grows. We skipped the burn cycle and guess what? It started coming back together. So we were able to document that and observe that. We burned them and we're now back to that 5 to 6 year interval again. We're starting to, we just finished a couple of weeks ago getting the preliminary data again so we can go burn them again. So we are continuing on with the tradition of that fire research at the station. It was during that time of Dr. Taylor and especially a grad student of his, Dr. Sam Fullendorf, who's at Oklahoma State, and it's kind of the fire guru of the South Plains, I would say now, to look at putting those two ecological disturbances together, fire and herbivory. I believe it was Sam who came up with the term pirate herbivory. And again, basically, that's just a good scientific name for putting those two disturbances, those two natural processes back together, using them on landscapes to try to rehab, maybe push the vegetation of those, maybe back toward a desired state or just toward to a state that we want it to be, so that we have better wildlife habitat, better livestock production, better watershed across. Just like we are here today at the Sonora Station, education, so we were born out of education, the need for education. It has been part of the 110-year history, and we're still doing it now. This is TCU Ranch Management Group there earlier in the year. They come out, their field trips that they make all across the southern plains, they come to us every year, and we talk about what we've been doing. And they go out and they become ranch managers. Some of them become county agents, some of them become educators. So education is part of what we do. And if you're really sharp-eyed, you can see BRB Ranch, Arizona. So I'm taking things that I learned 10 years ago and applying that and using that. So the education never stops at the state lines, and it doesn't stop when somebody moves to another job that's different kind of related. It sort of becomes the yeast that goes into other places. So we do a lot of work with different colleges. This is our range wildlife and fisheries management department. A group at Texas A&M, their capstone course comes out every year and considers our ranch to be their ranch that they're going to develop a 5-year plan for. So they come out and do a lot of our monitoring work for us. They map the station. They do a lot of things that they will then use to build their plan. Southwest Texas College, this is their wildlife management group. They're down in Uvalde, so they come up every year. Texas Tech comes, TCU comes. I've got workers now, research, people coming from Cornell, Rice, and the University of Texas. So it's been a hub, a lot of different education activities. One of the funnest things, also the most challenging, is working with undergraduate interns. Okay, I would try to. Some days, maybe, but generally speaking, no. They have been a great joy and been one of the things that I've been most proud of, to see them come and learn things and then go and grow up and do big things and be big people. And so this is just some of our interns. We involve them in everything we do. This one young lady here's bottle feeding the orphan goats. You know, and she got to do that 3 or 4 times a day all summer during her internship. They became best buds. This is a study here with the little black plastic balls that are in the water trough there. Another Arizona connection here. We learned how to use those shaped balls, and we're using those to decrease the evaporation from our water troughs. Interesting thing about those is that raccoons will play volleyball with them. So we're still working out some of the logistics of being able to let the livestock drink, the bats swoop if they need to, and to try to decrease the recreational activity. Part of the learning process. Can you find the guard dog? Yeah. Okay. Livestock guard dogs are one of our predator mitigation strategies that we use. As you can imagine, being a sheep and goat production area, which largely we are, cattle as well, but sheep and goats really drive the bus for us. Everything eats a little lamb, or raccoons, town dogs, stray cats, foxes, coyote, everything. So keeping them alive is a huge chore. The dogs are very effective. They are non-lethal most of the time. We have some of the dogs that will kill a predator, but most of the time they're just urinating on things. They're just out there. And, most predators don't want to take one of them on. It's a lot easier to go find something else to eat. So they have kind of become part of, the natural ecosystem in a livestock production area. Now, not all of them make good guard dogs. And go through them, not every horse is a good horse. Not every hunting dog makes a good hunting dog. Not every protection dog makes a good. So part of our research is kind of trying to work through that and come up with training and bonding procedures and what breeds are better on small ranges versus large ranges or their family lines. So we're in the process of that. We do have a lot of field days involved in that. So that's been one of our big kind of region-wide research projects there. So how are we doing on time? We doing good? Y'all have appointments or anything? Okay. We good?
It's like 41.
All right, okay. So this is just a list. I'm not expecting you to read all of those, but these are some of the projects that we got going on the property at the station right now. And I'm gonna kind of hit on some of these as we go forward here, kind of finish things up. So I talked about that +1, we kind of went through that vaccine and toxic plant area, and then the grazing system area, and the prescribed fire grazing fire herbivory area. And now we're in the 10 years that I've been there as the chief scientist, we kind of shifted to putting all of those together, pieces of the puzzle, and kind of trying to come around this unifying concept. The concept is grazing animal physiology. And that's a big mouthful. Basically, if you've got either an animal or a landscape that is in a stable state, it's healthy, everything's working good, you always have these disturbances or these stresses that are in this push and pull type of atmosphere all the time. There are things that stress us that can be detrimental to our. There are stressful things that actually kind of what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, kind of a thing. Same thing with the disturbances on the land. We talk about intermediate disturbance hypothesis or stress gradient hypothesis. So I kind of came up with this deal. A lot of people talk about a bowl and a cup or ball and a cup. And the ball being us or being the ecosystem, we always kind of want to be at rest in the bottom of that cup. And I think it's actually the other way. I think we're actually kind of teetering on a bubble. Now, some of us, the top of that bubble is bladder. Stay healthy, most of the time, and we're pretty resilient. Some of us, our bubble may have a little more peak to it, maybe kind of teetering on disaster most of the time. We're always being pushed and pulled in these different directions, trying to kind of keep that homeostasis or that stable state of an ecosystem. And I start to think of these together as, and they're interacting with each other. So a lot of times we tend to think of sort of animals when we're doing research in a vacuum, and we kind of think of landscapes and soils and plants in a vacuum. So we have range, botany, people. We have reproductive physiology, livestock people. And they don't really ever talk to each other and speak different languages. But the veterinarians and the animal health and the physiology people are working with animals, and unless they're in confined feeding, they're out of pasture grazing. So they're experiencing life. They're trying to find shade. They're trying to find water. They're trying to keep the whatever from eating their baby. You know, all these sorts of things. So all those are stressful. The way they handle themselves in that landscape does a stressed group of lactating herbivores use the landscape differently than a late pregnant, not lactating, thermoneutral. Are they grazing in different places? Are they selecting different plants? That's kind of what this concept is about. Is it all the way down to this molecular level, organelle cells, organs. As we move up, all the way up to an ecosystem, we're having different effects on the animals and on the plants. Guess what? They're interacting with each other. So cellular things that are happening in that lactating mother who's trying to raise that baby and keep the bear or the whatever eating it, is having an effect on how she behaves and where she goes to eat and where she finds cover, that sort of thing. Well, does that make then the riparian area the most used part of the landscape, or the hill slope is away from places where the predators or the insects or whatever don't hang out? So trying to understand all of these connections is what I've been trying to do at the research station. Depending on whatever funding I can get, I'm working on bits and pieces and trying to cobble it together. So that's what we've been doing the last 10 years. So to start off with, we're doing that soil, water, vegetation type research. One of the things that we've been doing is looking again at those junipers, and when we burn them and then they start to regrow, what happens to the toxic components in there? Do they increase? Do they decrease? Do they shift to different parts of the plant? You know, we don't really know. So this is some work that we're doing. Dan Burson has gotten her PhD now, did a lot of individual juniper burns, followed the regrowth on those burns. She collected tissue before, tissue after at different seasons of burn, ran the chemistry on those to get the terpenes. And then these are some, different plots of the different types of terpenes. So we do get different families of terpenes, if you want to think of them that way, that will change from before the burns to after the burns, in between a red berry species that resprouts and a blueberry species that doesn't. So there are a lot of different complexities going on there, but this has given us the ability to kind of start to think about how these changes from these disturbances might have effects on what's in that forage for the families. Another grad student of mine, Camille Carey, is the most enthusiastic person I have ever met about bugs. As she would tell me to say insects, and especially those under the ground. Kind of important. Here's a hoot. Nobody thinks about those. They're there. They're very important. And the microbes get a lot of press now. We think about soil microbes. No, well, there's macros organisms that are there too. So she did a lot of work on the station. Now, this dotted line here is to show you where the actual soil is. So this is kind of deceiving. This is a big soil pit, and a lot of the dirt is covered up with rock. That's really about how deep our soil is there. We have all these different kind of organisms that are there. We tend to think about, tumblebugs and earthworms and things like that. Tick larvae, microscorpions. I mean, she could sit there and rattle off all of this. One of the things that she learned from her research of these different areas of disturbance on the ranch is that these food webs change depending on the disturbance. predators become prey. Some places they ship. And so I can't wait for her to get this out, get into journal articles. She's doing a faculty job. You know, so I'm gonna try to call her on the way home Saturday, and we're gonna work on her journal paper. Because she's got some fascinating, really, seminal type stuff that nobody's really doing, especially in dry environments. A lot of the work's being done in Germany and in Europe and in wetter environments on these soil organisms. She could hardly find any literature about the insects that she was working with in dry environments. It's wide open. Tim Lyons, some of you may know or remember, he was a grad student here in Arizona at the time I was here, went to work for Bill. You know, he's now in Texas. He's a PhD student of mine. And so we are working on being able to take LiDAR, 3D point clouds. This is some work we did prior to Tim coming on board. We can take a juniper tree, and there's a typical photo. Here's a LiDAR image, and here's a color ramp of what forage would be available to a browser. Okay, green would be to any animal that feeds in a quadrupedal stance, you know, sheep, cows, and young animals. The yellow would be those deer, goats, would be a bipedal feeding stance. And then the red would be that part of the tree that nothing is ever going to browse until we get giraffes or camels. So I hope we don't. This can also be used for fuel models. Because if we've got, you know, fuel under here, we've got ladder fuel, you know, in a ground crawling fire, we may pick up some of this and we may get, but we're going to have this top area. It's probably not going to be very much affected by heat and that sort of thing. So there's a variety of things we can do with this. So what we're doing is taking near infrared spectra of tissue. This is grass, this is not needles, but same thing. We're collecting tissues. And our intent is to be able to do some work like was being done up at University of Northern Arizona. Dr. Sankey has created these landscapes with LiDAR. And again, these are height above ground. But height is interesting to us because we need to know how much forage or fuel would be available to our animals or to our fire. What we want to be able to do is look at the chemistry in that vegetative material. We can take the NIR spectra of it. We can pair that with the chemical values. And we can now take LiDAR imagery on an iPhone. Well, when Tim started this work 3 years ago, we were going to do this with drones and with satellite imagery. And these iPhones have gotten better and affordable and available. And we said, you know, if we're going to put this science into the hands of people who can use it, let's do it on the phones. And we'll worry about scaling it up to the landscape later. But these photos were taken about 2 or 3 weeks ago. These are juniper bushes on the Sonora Station. These are different angles. But once we put all of this together, we can take a LiDAR image, take the NIR spectrum, and put the chemistry there, you'll hit the button. We should be able to put a color ramp on this plant of terpene concentration, of nitrogen, of cellulose, whatever it is that we're interested in. So we're this close. I've got the math put together in a very crude, it's hard for me to say the SAS program. Everybody now uses R and a lot of these other things, but I put it together in SAS and I've handed it to Tim, and he's going to take it, go do all the machine learning, you know, AI, different things that this old gentleman here don't have the time to do, and he probably couldn't do anyway. So I'm gonna hand it off to a younger brain, and he's working on this, and we're this close to being able to get all this put together. Where maybe in a year or two we can do this on our phone. So pretty excited. Okay, what about those animals that are eating this material? What does that do to them? Or what machinery do they have, metabolically speaking, that the ones who don't eat so much juniper have? So we did a slaughter study. We took 10 young animals that would be about 2 years old, 10 older animals that had been about 4 years old, which then would have had different levels of exposure to eating juniper. We had the low group, which would eat less than average, high group, which would eat greater than average. And this gamma glutamyl transferase, GGT, pretty common enzyme that's used to test for liver damage. Guess what? In the high animals, they have greater indication that they have experienced some liver damage. as a 4-year-old. Now, still within the veterinary levels of acceptance. So it's not out of the healthy range, but by those time those animals are 6 or 7 or 8, it might be. So this might tell us that if we're gonna use these animals and they're gonna be in a high juniper environment, they may age out faster than our normal animals would. They may go to slaughter faster than an animal, breeding animal that we would keep in the herd of goats for maybe 8 or 10 years. So this also has some indications for us as we are consuming different types of plants and things that might also damage our livers. What can we learn from these animals as well? So pretty interesting stuff that we can do here. We've also kind of returned to our roots a little bit, and we're doing some toxic plant work. Bitterweed is one of the plants that's a big problem for sheep in particular. Bitterweed poisoning. They start having things come out of both ends when they start to eat this. Again, not very pleasant. We had pipelines going through the range, and they planted a lot of that stuff for us, going from one place to the next. So we did a little study where we went out and looked at our grazed areas, disturbed pastures. We do have bitterweed there. We do have an old pipeline that's about 20 or 30 years old, and we do have a little bit of bitterweed there. Guess what? The new pipeline had overwhelmingly more bitterweed. So our energy development there did cause us some issues with toxic plant all through our part of the world. So again, going back to toxicity of bitterweed for sheep from a 1937 publication that came out of the station. So again, returning to our roots, going back, doing research that may be old, but still relevant. Doing a lot of rangeland nutritional monitoring. Again, we use, we'll clip forage, we'll do the typical range monitoring trend and production type work. We'll also collect fecal samples from the animals, run that through a laboratory, but using that near infrared spectroscopy again, if we can tell from the fecal chemistry, something about the diet those animals had, metabolized and left the evidence of what that diet was on the ground was. We were part of a statewide project looking at using this fecal technology again. This would be representative of a pretty high quality diet. This would be a little less, still pretty good quality diet. We were able to predict body conditions of animals through the production period. There, we can project for the next 30 days or so what we think those animals are going to gain or lose on that forage. That gives us information. Should we move them? Should we start to feed them something? Gives us, the ability to manage their nutrition, see to their health, and their productivity. We are also combining some of our livestock and wildlife research. Again, we know they're all living in the same neighborhood out there. And we study a variety of different types of animals. This one happens to be the spot-tailed earless lizard. This is the plateau subspecies of that lizard. And Texas Parks and Wildlife had received a petition to list this as a threatened or endangered species. There's 2 different subspecies. There's more of a coastal version down along South Texas coast, and there's the plateau version where I live. And so we did some research there and come to find out these lizards are doing fine. They're healthy, they're breeding, there are plenty of them. They're great. Don't see them a lot. They can be kind of explicit, but we've got them, and we had some young ladies that were very good at taking a fishing pole with a little bit of loop of monofilament line on them, catching them, putting the little trackers on them and things like that. So they were our lizard growth. Anyway, spot-tailed earless lizard is doing its fine. We've also hired a new person at San Angelo at our research center, Dr. Andy Kasner, who is he's a range specialist, but he also specializes in birds. And so he's been doing a lot of the population bird watching, making those checks and counts, seeing what we have. And I'm really, really interested in this, especially to see how our management may change the habitat for these species. What types of birds are going to be telling us that we're doing a really good job in certain areas because they're liking these areas. Maybe we're moving some around as we move fire across the landscape, as we're covering and all. We know we're going to move some different species around. So he's really been a key piece of our team to be able to get that data for us. Now, I'm gonna finish up with kind of the, sort of the capstone program that I put in there at the station in not just me, in collaboration with a lot of other folks. But we're calling it the Sonora Rangeland Stewardship System. And so it's gonna take a lot of different best management practices, things that have been developed at the station, developed other places. Try to put them together and let's do an economic analysis of what does it cost us to be successful in managing rangeland habitat with this type of a system versus another. And a lot of this, the flex part of this has come out of previous things that we talked about. Here's that same type of a standardized precipitation index graph like I showed you for the early part of the talk, specifically looking at the growing season. This is annual. So this line here is about 22 inches of rain in our station there. You can see, again, there have been some very wet periods and there have been some very extended drought periods, very similar to that chart that we saw earlier. This is that drought in the 50s. This is the drought record for our part of the world. Thing that jumps out about this when I first saw this. Look at how much variation we had in the first part of the 1900s. And here's where I was born, 1961. Still variation. Look at how much less it is compared to what we had prior to. Now, I point this out to the students. Look at how much variation there is we're giving to them. Okay, we're right back here. It was just before that. Is that coming?
Yeah.
Probably. Hope not. Pray not. Because I don't want anybody to have to go through all that. We've had enough of it as it is. But point of the Sonoraplex stewardship system is to get ready, plan for it. Let's be proactive. So yeah. Go to the next one. So.
Sorry about
back
that.
one. So this is just to point out that it's relatively speaking, it's not Arizona. Relatively speaking, it's dry in Southwest Texas. And we're in a drought probably 6 out of every 10 years. And a drought at some period of time. Now, in our monsoon system here, we expect it to be dry at times and wet. We don't quite have that. We're a little more bimodal and a little flatter in our rainfall distribution there. But most years, we're pretty dry. So why would we manage for the average? Doesn't make sense. Okay. So what we've done here is we've set up an experiment. This is that original Merrill 4-pasture 3-herd system. So I get to experience history all the time as a range nerd. You know, that history for me. We set that back up in a 4-pasture system again. Right across the fence, we paired that. We took some pasture fences out, created a larger pasture, and these are not big compared to what you're used to in this part of the world. We've got a continuous with patch burning treatment here. We've got the Sonora Flex where on years that we have the ability to, we will work burning into that. And the 3 herds on this always be 2 herds of actual animals. The 3rd herd will be dictated by the conditions of the year. That's the flex. We've got rain, we've got forage, it'll be animals. If we've got rain, we've got forage, but we don't have maybe enough water, maybe that's the year that we rest at, or we burn it, or, you know, the flex is what makes the most sense for us to do with that 3rd quote unquote herd in any given year. Okay, now there's nothing magic about 4 pastures. You could do this with 3, you could do it with 20, you could do, you know, but building the flexibility into it is the key part of it. So we got 2 replications of that now. We got 2 replications of the continuous with the patch burning, and we are stocked at a level that would be, we think would be adequate and the right level for that 17 or 18 inches of rain, not 22. The most often occurring, not the average. So a lot of years we'll get 16, 17, 18 inches, and that's more normal. Then we get those 40-year or 40-inch flood years, it bumps the average up. So we're stocking for the most often occurring drought, which is about 75% of parents. We're doing multi-species grazing, so sheep and goat country. We will have cattle when we can have cattle. We, in the 10 years that I've been there, we've grazed, we've developed 4 sets of heifers. We don't have cows, we don't have them year round, so we have animals when we have the grass. And that flex grazing, maybe cow, maybe sheep, maybe goats. We'll see, it'll depend on the year. Again, those will be game time decisions made by what the conditions are during that particular year. So we're working off of the NRCS state transition model for our part of the world. It's Low Stony Hill ecological site. And this would have been more of the historic climax 200 years ago, more of a grassland savanna, that part of the world. Remember that first graph that I showed you that we're increasing woodland and we're stocking rates going down? It's because a lot of our country now looks like this, almost a closing in juniper, live oak, and some places mesquite wood. So that's why the stocking rate is much less. Fewer things eat 20-foot tall live oaks, 20-foot tall junipers, we have seen anything. Now, wildlife are a big component economically of our ranching industry there. Some people make more money off of their hunting operation than they do off of their livestock operation. More people are starting to do ecotourism, bird watching, night sky, just getting out of town, being where I can't hear traffic, those types of things. This type of an area is more of what they are interested in, because this is where deer live. But I will argue, there's just so many deer out here, you just don't see them. They're good at hiding. They lay down in the grass. If I manage the grass correctly, they can hide from you under that. It's like they can hide from you in that. But what I'm trying to do is manage to be somewhere in between woodland savanna and the grassland savanna. It gives me a tipping point I can measure. How is my management doing? And look at it from an economic standpoint. Land is, an investment. The way you make money off land is selling it. If I'm going to sell a ranch, I'm not going to sell very many ranches out in our part of the world that look like that, because people say there's no deer. No. Okay, they're there. They're wrong. They're there, but they think this, so they're going to pay more for that. So I'm trying to stay just in between that. I'm going to get an optimum, I think, of grazing and browsing, wildlife habitat, watershed, the different distribution of birds. I mean, diversity. I'm gonna have my cake and eat it too, if all of this works. And if at some point my role or my goal as a rancher was to prove this ranch and sell it, I'm gonna probably get a better price for it right there than if I had it right there. Probably if I did it. So it's all part of the mission. It's to just with the biology, the ecology, the economics, because they all have to fit. Yeah. That is a rabbit. And so we just recently moved the windmill that was at the middle of that Merrill system. We had decommissioned the windmill, put a solar well or pump there, pump the water for that well. So we moved it to we call it Pila, a reservoir just across from our headquarters. We painted it with the origination date of the station in commemoration of this event that we had coming up. So I hope this was informative. I hope it was somewhat entertaining and useful to you. And I suspect, let's say, probably a nice third piece of that step from Santa Rita to the Horn to the Sonora Station, and maybe have a little bit better appreciation of why the 3 of these 100-year-old or more Southwest range stations have done great things and need to get together and do great things. So with that, I will stop and take questions if that's the agenda. Absolutely. He's going for 2 weeks.
Yeah, no, when you showed the disturbed area.
Mhm.
And after that started to grow, there it was all over the place. What we get rid of
So. The best way,
undergraduates?
say again,
Undergraduates?
there are not enough of them and they're not working that hard. There are some chemical treatments that you can use and all. The best way to get rid of it is to prevent it being there to begin with, which, you know, we weren't successful in doing that. There were guys that were making, 6-figure salaries that were posted at every gate of every new ranch. Went through there, that had spray, that were supposed to stop there. I don't know if they were taking naps, I'm not sure what they were doing, bringing water. Anyway, it didn't get done. So to answer your question, the best way we've been able to handle it is we had a drought. We didn't get rain in the winter, and so we kind of broke that cycle on there. If we'd had a couple, 3 wet years in a row, I don't know that we would have been able to get rid of it without a severe chemical treatment. So there are treatments, they're costly. So the drought came and did us a favor in that regard. And having the growing season precip didn't favor the bitter weed, which comes on earlier. So the winter precip would have been better for that.
Does the weather service help you figure out when you want to do a burn? Figuring that there's going to be a drought?
They don't help us per se as far as actively reaching out to us. I use their products. There's some very good fire weather stations available that I'll go and get forecasts when I'm planning to do burn. I'll get the latest and greatest one that I can on the morning or afternoon before we're actually going to go out. So I absolutely use a lot of weather tools, you know, to try to get that humidity, wind, temperature, nexus where I want it to be. But in the back here, and then we'll come here.
A couple questions. Can you show that trough full of black balls? It'd be better if those balls were white.
You know, we actually did thermometers under that as well. Those black balls, by absorbing the heat, kept they kept the temperature underneath at a more constant level. So it was actually cooler in the summer and for a little while warmer in the winter. So we probably on those troughs would get about a day of not having to chop ice, week long, cold snap.
My other question was, up for Montana, sheep have definitely decreased in Montana. Are we finding that everywhere? The price of wool and the demand for wool has gone down so much that.
And I'm not the best one to answer this question, but, we don't eat as much lamb as we do beef, chicken, pork. Younger generations that have been introduced to lamb, I think have started to like it and purchase it. So I think some of our lamb consumption is going to go up. Goat consumption, not so much. And the sheep and goat consumption in this country is primarily driven by certain ethnic groups. And so the production of sheep and goats has shifted to produce the type of animal that they want to purchase. There's more sheep and goat eaten around the world, than there are some of the other beef choices that are out there. But in the US, we don't consume as much sheep and goat as other countries do. So people from those countries who come here, a lot of them want to eat that. And so that's what a lot of our production is geared toward those specific, ethnic groups.
You want to stop your fund?
I'm sorry. Yeah, we were gonna go here and then there. Yeah, and then I think in the back. Okay, so.
Yeah, this is continuing on with the sheep.
Yeah.
USDA has a sheep experiment station in Eastern Iowa. Do you have any kind of relationship with them?
There's been several, kind of like that Zaragoza thing. There's been kind of a stream of people who have come through Montana State and come through that Du Bois, Idaho station.
Yeah.
My previous boss had been the boss up there at one point in time. We've had several grad students that have come and gone through there. So we don't have any specific formal projects going on with them. But yes, there's been a lot of information exchange and personnel exchange back.
They have a much narrower focus than you have.
So I've never set foot on the place. I've known several people that work.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's in a pretty part of the world. I know that.
Okay, could you talk about your funding stream?
Got much time. Let's see.
I'm really curious about how the ranchers contribute to the funding of the information, of the work that's done that provides information for their success.
So, we're a land grant university, we get federal funding, when it comes to, the hatch funds that were created, the first period's on the same thing. So we get those trickle down to us and they're just dispersed out from the federal government to the states, and then the state offices or put them, at our different research stations. We have 13 different regional research stations in the state of Texas. San Angelo is the one that I'm about an hour and a half south of, connected to them. So we do get the federal funding that is just sort of baseline funding that every state gets a certain amount. Everything else is competitive. And so I jump in and compete with these guys and other people, when a call comes out to do whatever type of research, sometimes we get together and collaborate, do things like that. So we do a lot of, so I spend a lot of time writing grants and chasing money. And we have the same thing. There's some state funding sources that we can compete for. There's some private funding, industry, different foundations, things like that. So a lot of what we do is write grants, try to get that funding. We tell everybody we can only do the research we get funded. Now I can take available our research together because I have land, I have animals, and collect information on it because I'm managing them. We operate pretty much like any other commercial ranch in Southwest Texas would. There's livestock, we have hunting. We deal with roving water lines, we deal with, impression, we deal with who's gonna come out here and do this work. Nobody wants to be 25 miles out in the middle of nowhere between two little bitty towns. No Starbucks. I mean, it's very spot. So we deal with all those same things. So the funding then is just, it's always a competitive deal, chasing money all the time. So.
You kind of mentioned it with like the life cycle, the toxicity of what the animals are eating, and then eventually with human consumption. With the black plastic balls, has there been any interest in studying like microplastics and how that leaches in the water and then passing it on to humans?
Yes. So big topic we looked into really hard before we decided to start doing this. To our knowledge, the best that we can discover from the research that we did, not only from the company, but from third parties and all, the breakdown, the life of these is over like a 70 or 80 year period. So, and then even at that point, which is the toxic part of it, but anyway, the microplastics and the chemical, it could be a problem if it was in a toxic level, hasn't reached that yet. But if you budget out about a 10, 12, 15 year window, and just it's recyclable. So just take those, go recycle them, get another. For the amount of evaporation loss that you're preventing, it's going to pay out, and they'll pay for themselves sooner on most size tanks. We've actually done this on this size tank versus certain sizes. How many balls does that take? I think they were about 50 cents a piece, something like that. So they're not cheap.
Sure.
But when you're paying diesel to pump water, when you're trying to keep a windmill going, anyway, we penciled it out, and I want to say it was about a 10 or 12 year good return on investment. You're not anywhere approaching what might possibly someday be a health problem. And so you're just staying ahead of the game. And they've started to get a little weaker at that point. The raccoons have taken them and getting them or whatever they're doing. But I think it was about a 10 or 12 year window that it kind of costed out to be pretty effective and gets around that potential for a toxicity problem. Now, somebody may tomorrow publish a paper that says, no, that's not right. But as far as we know, with the work that we've done, should be a safe product, because we don't want to put them out there for our animals. I don't want to put them out there for my employees or neighbors or anything like that. Yeah.
So along that same line, are there a lot of ranchers who are using those plastic balls?
Not yet. Now, I don't know if this is a good measure, but on Facebook, when we put pictures out about that and we started showing what we were doing, that was the most popular post that we did for like 2 years. None of the sheep work, none of the goat work, none of these really scientific things, that I come up with and all my grad students. People were interested in the shape. Water's a big deal, as you all know, in Arizona. It's a big deal, Southwest Texas. And so small landowners, large landowners, 3, 4 generation ranches, bought the ranch yesterday. Everybody seemed to be interested in that topic. So we're continuing to try to do that work. We knew it was gonna slow down the evaporation. We knew that. We didn't know what the temperature was gonna be. We didn't know if there were gonna be any E. coli or anything like that. We studied all that. We had no issues with any of that. What we haven't done yet is build a watering ramp for the bats, so we can put them in big reservoirs and still leave a lane for them to come and swoop in and drink. And we haven't figured out, we're not in an area where we don't get a lot of waterfowl, things like that. But the other areas of the country, we need to kind of work that out as well. How many is the right amount on a 5 acre dirt tank, for instance? So that you have some open area, but you're still reducing the evaporation, you're getting the bang for your buck, but you're doing it in a way that's not gonna be detrimental to the livestock or the wildlife. Again, bugs, mice, birds, bucks and bulls. So I'm trying to think of all of those different aspects, trying to keep that whole ball rolling off the boat.
So I was curious, you coordinate with the ranchers around you, because you talked about your flex system, sometimes you have cows, sometimes not. Do you own all the animals, or are they borrowed or at least?
Yeah, excellent question. Right now, we own everything that we're grazing, with the exception of, we do have some Angora, the shaggy mohair goats, that we still do a billy test for the mohair goats. So we have client-owned animals that are on the ranch that we're doing the test. Everything else, XAM, AgriLife owns those. With the size of the cow herd now, with the border being closed, we can't bring Mexican cattle across. There are a lot of dynamics that are happening there. People are needing to keep more heifers if we're gonna produce more beef, not be people as we go forward. So there may come a time that we will take on some outside animals, and either for research purposes or for income money. Yep. If we can make some money, that buys some feed, puts tires on the truck, pays that student worker for the summer, all those types of things. So we may do more that public-private partnership type deal, because the industry may dictate that we need to.
So can you address the schoolworm problem? Because there's always been schoolworm in South Texas. Why is it a major problem now?
So it is endemic to, it was in the southern part of the US all the way down through to South America. Why is it a problem now? So with the work that was done in the 20s, 30s up to really become effective and eradicated the screwworm in the US by the 60s to 70s. So it was gone. So we didn't have to deal with it anymore. Gone from our part of the world, still south. It has now made its way past a lot of the containment zone around you think of Panama, the isthmus, it's easier to contain something that needs to be on land in a narrow area of land. It's gotten out of that. It's made its way north through Mexico. It has been documented. I think 70 miles is the closest from the river from the border of Texas, which is probably about 200 miles or so from where I'm at. It was an isolated case. So, but they're on their way. They're going to come back. And why is it a problem? These flies, the females, can exploit something as small as a tick bite, or just a little nick. So when you think of larger wounds, bucks biting and knocking the velvet off, animals walking through cactus, or in our pens walking past maybe a piece of wire sticking out or something like that, they get cuts. Birth, castration, things that we do deeply. If we create a wound, flies are there. They lay their larvae in the wound. So they're typical maggot blowflies, except they eat live tissue and dead tissue. So they can be a huge problem. You hear all the horror stories, the flesh-eating fly is invaded the US. Well, they're not yet, but they're on the way. And I think we'll see these little incursions here. They're kind of like the fever tick that we have now. We'll find them, we'll circle actions, we'll treat. It's going to be pretty economically devastating to the people where they ride. And we don't have the labor. We don't have the facilities. We're not geared for it. we've been spoiled by not having to deal with them for the last 40 years or so.
It's a classic success story.
Yeah. If you're interested in reading things like that, if you'll Google and look back to the history of how that sterile fly technique was developed, it's fascinating. And there's you could make a TV show about it. These guys, the scientists, had to sneak around sometimes to do this work because they were afraid they were going to be ridiculed. It's a sterile male mates with a female so that there's no viable eggs. How do you know that the female only mates once in her life? Okay, think about that. Somebody had to watch. Okay. Imagine being a scientist, got funding, and what are you doing? I'm watching flies do their thing. Who's going to fund that? And who's, so the human side of this is really fascinating how they persevered through that to develop a technique that, like I said, hugely successful.
What's to stop us from just taking that technique and doing it?
Say it again.
What's to stop humans, people in the United States, from taking that technique, the sterile fly and doing it?
We are.
Yeah.
So with money. So there's a facility in Panama. It was put in place to produce those flies, and I can't quote you all the exact numbers, but millions of them. And then they get on planes and they put them in little containers that break when you get to the ground. They drop these sterile males, and they go out into the wild population, and that's how you control it. It's being done today as we speak. The U.S. is now in the process. I think maybe have broken ground in South Texas to build a facility. It'll be online in a year or two. See, to produce them here and distribute them on our side of it. And then we're looking at all sorts of other types of treatments that would also hopefully be as effective and maybe cost less and not be as much of a production. That facility runs 24/7, 365 in Panama.
There's investment back into that facility from the US now too. So it's been part of the roller coaster for the last few years. It's just funding goes away, funding gets reinjected, funding increases, funding goes away again. I think it's a really important point that Doug is bringing up with all of this, as far as, somebody says, I want funding to look at manufacturing of these flies, right? It comes off as a fairly wild and crazy idea, but ultimately, from a land-grant perspective, someplace like Texas A&M, NMSE, or the University of Arizona, that's ultimately what we're here to do. But at the end of the day, how those flies mingle, breed, and interact, it's something that I wouldn't know I care about, frankly. But that's the point, is that it doesn't do me good, doesn't do good, it doesn't pockets to get these sorts of research dollars. The point is that we leverage those, the expertise of somebody like Doug and the centers that we work on to be able to reinvest and say, no, we really do care about this. This is what it means for our industry partners. This is what it means for policy decisions that help fund these sorts of efforts that are going to come back to us. And so it's one link in that chain, but it's very, very important. And so when we talk about this is what we're trying to do and it's why I think you did a great job of highlighting the interconnected nature of all of this, because that is something that we run into a lot, right? Is we say, okay, well, we're working on this project here, we're working on this project here, and then somebody like ourselves can sit back and like, why aren't you working on these projects together? And so it's really trying to shore that up. We were joking about this a little bit at the beginning. We're trying to do that within the University of Arizona already, same with Texas A&M. And that's a challenge enough. At the same time, we're trying to grow that and then expand so that way we can capitalize on some of the work that's happening in Texas, apply it here. Great to be able to pick up the phone or send out an email and say, hey, we're doing these things. What do you think? Doug can get in touch and say, hey, I agree doing these things in this project and have a free flow of information. So we might be competing for the same grant dollars, we might be on a project for the same grant dollars. It doesn't really matter, but we want to make sure that information is back. So that's a critical piece. And without that interconnectedness of the whole thing, it's not that it falls apart, but it doesn't work.
And I'll hear people say, well, this is livestock. I'm not really concerned about that. Whether you eat meat or don't. but these flies are non-discriminatory. They're not gonna just attack the, purebred Angus cow, deer, birds. Any warm-blooded animal made out of meat, made out of flesh, that they can exploit an opening. Deposit larvae, is a target. So I tell you, when we'll start to get a lot of, and I may offend somebody by saying this. I'll tell you when we'll start to get a lot of money, it's when somebody's poodle
Yeah.
gets. Y'all have a poodle, I'm sorry, I just. I could have said Australian Shepherd. But, when the general public is impacted by it directly, then I think we'll start to get some better.
Senator's granddaughter.
Yeah,
There you go.
there.
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you again. We appreciate the time. We appreciate all of your time as well. We're not going to wrap up entirely, so if y'all have any more questions for those that are interested, we are going to be having a barbecue right out here. So please help yourselves. We've had hamburgers, hot dogs, and veggie burgers, chips, drinks, things of that nature. So please make yourselves at home. I unfortunately have to duck out in just a couple minutes and drive halfway across the state. So if you do have any questions, please let me know, but we just wanted to be able to say thank you to all of you as well. We really appreciate the opportunity to do this on an annual basis. It's something that we're trying to grow. So I recognize a place like Santa Rita as an important part of the community, just as Sonora Station. None of this happens without your support. It's really hard to be able to sit back, again, unless somebody's poodle gets attacked. Why are we co-opting 52,000 acres worth of viable state land that can be used for other things if we're doing these sorts of research? And so we have to be able to translate what's the benefit back to the people of Arizona, people in the United States, and then ultimately look at global impacts. And so this is what we're trying to do, but none of that happens without yourself. So just want to say thank you all again, very much appreciated.
Thank you.